the top center of the image, now scrolling up rapidly, it says the Whitechapel Mystery. And Whitechapel is, of course, the neighborhood in London associated with the Jack the Ripper murders. And that's why he was also called the Whitechapel Murderer. Anyway, this series of unsolved killings, maybe the most famous series of all time, occurred from 1888 to 1891. And they, of course, caused a sensation right from the get-go. In fact, they did that to such a degree that same year or the following, I read a couple of different versions, but regardless, some people in Chicago, Illinois, USA, some 3,945 miles away from London, created a private club called the Whitechapel Club. This was done by a group of men, all or mostly journalists, who I guess you could best describe as true crime fans, but they took their fandom to some pretty extreme lengths. It was also called the Suicide Club, and the group's members were encouraged to laugh in the face of death. And they took that seriously, ironically, if you will. But for instance, they cremated one of their members who committed suicide and then kept his ashes in an urn and had initiates sift their fingers through them. And that deceased member, Morris Allen Collins, was actually the head of the Dallas chapter, Dallas, where I live. So apparently there was a franchising of sorts, but all the remaining information, and there's not much about this, centers on the original in Chicago, which itself was a short-lived enterprise, lasting 8 years. Anyway, back to Mr. Collins. Before he shot himself in the head, he let the club know they could use his body for their purposes, and they did. In Chicago, or outside of Chicago, they went to some sand dunes, built a huge pyre, 20 feet by 18 feet, made mostly out of driftwood. It's probably a laborious process to construct this thing, but anyway, they were near Lake Michigan. And it's said that they circled the burning pyre 3 times, singing hymns, and while drinking copious amounts of whiskey, partied on into the night and all the way until the dawn. So with that giving you a flavor of the club, let's get to the basics. They claimed, tongue-in-cheek, claimed that Jack the Ripper was the president of their club, so it was actually run and officiated by the vice president. Hilarious, right? I mean, keep in mind that the Jack the Ripper murders were active at this time, and the signature ones that started all this had just happened. And in those, of course, women were just horribly, horribly mutilated. But these guys, and yes, they were all guys, it was a men-only-allowed type thing, and they did not let a fear of contradicting good taste get in their way. The Jack the Ripper shtick was only a part of it. Their little headquarters were adorned with authentic grisly items like, quote, the bloody slipper of a Chinese merchant killed by a streetcar, a blood-stained shirt taken from the body of a Native American killed at the Battle of Wounded Knee, pieces of fire engines destroyed in Chicago's Great Fire of 1871. Keep in mind, that's a recent tragedy from this very city where hundreds of people died. A coffin served as a table or bar, and there were actual skeletons, or at least one, and many skulls. Some of those skulls were lighting fixtures. Here's an account looking back. They, quote, had the crowns of the skulls sawed off and the eye holes enlarged. He set a prism of red, green, blue, yellow, or purple glass in each of the eye holes. The skulls were then mounted on the gas jets, and when the lights were turned on, there was a beautiful and dignified stained glass effect, end quote. The skulls, by the way, were said to be sourced from a local asylum, a nearby asylum, while skulls used as drinking goblets came from local prostitutes. That certainly matching with the Jack the Ripper fascination. Other accoutrements involved actual murder weapons that were sourced by, policemen who were members of the club. There were photographs of Chinese pirates both before and after their beheadings, a blood-stained Native American blanket from one of the many battles in which they were being displaced, and speaking of that, supposedly a boot from the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is where Custer was killed, with the bones still in it. Remember, we said that journalists started the club, but they weren't the only members. They were the predominant ones. Only 2 men of any other profession could be in the club at the same time as members, in fact. Members could also be artists, musicians, lawyers, doctors. We already mentioned policemen. Guests were allowed, but that was a very selective thing. Some of them included two future presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley, as well as two very notable boxers, and boxing at this time was as popular a sport as there was, John Sullivan and Gentleman Jim Corbett. And now the club was kind of a literary society of sorts. Members would give speeches, mercilessly criticize each other's speeches and writing. The speeches were, of course, related to the topic of death. Overall, this was the kind of semi-secret society, boys' club, excuse to drink and just be ridiculous type of thing that was popular with men at the time. The fascination with not just death, but outright murder, including very recent scandalous murders, and the extremely irreverent tone they took with those topics is, of course, what set them apart. Here's what one of the founding members wrote about it, and you're going to notice how it describes this whole enterprise as kind of a breakaway from the more mainstream journalist club. The Whitechapel Club was young with hope, and it was bizarre. It was literary, and the press club, on the whole, was not. The Whitechapel Club was inclined to believe that punk was the main basis of all society as then organized. What men said publicly, they denied privately. Judges, lawyers, merchants, and ministers could go as civilians to the Whitechapel Club and express opinions the opposite of what they daily proclaimed in the press. The boys of the Whitechapel Club took the other end of this proposition. They talked and they decorated their club on a scheme and scale far more diabolical than anything whatever within their real intentions. Murder and rapine were their shibboleths. Pestilence was proclaimed to dwell under their lintels. Revolvers, knives, handcuffs, chains, manacles, knouts, skulls, red-labeled bottles with crossbones adorned their walls. The table of their board of directors was shaped like a great coffin, and they burned their dead long before it was fashionable. Outside of the Whitechapel, as it were, there reigned a dull, yet a cunning hypocrisy. Inside Whitechapel, there were youth and amateurism, but it was neither dull nor disingenuous there. I'm showing images related to the Jack the Ripper killings, by the way, because there's only so many related to the Whitechapel Club. Now, we mentioned before this was a men's-only club, which was standard practice for the day, but the big break and the beginning of the end for the Whitechapel Club all came about because they allowed a woman in. And here she is. She went by the name of Omen. Belly dancing was, of course, a very exotic thing at this time and place. But regardless, what ended up happening is that she told the story of her visit to the San Francisco Call newspaper in 1893. Quote, "It was in fact a regular chamber of horrors, far worse indeed than anything I have witnessed before, but I must tell you the worst is yet to come. I had not only to sit down on a coffin, but the table was made of coffins also. And the flowers were placed in the heads of the dead men, skulls, I suppose. Yes, skulls. There was nothing else but skulls and bones and coffins. Diablo." And because of this and just general word of mouth, the word was getting out about the club. And as you can imagine, more people, especially powerful men in Chicago, wanted in on the hijinks. Speaking of hijinks, this was also kind of a prankster thing. Not that this was their bread and butter, but they would do these outrageous public stunts once in a while, like fielding somebody for mayor, with the slogan, "No gas, no water, no police." Here's another article related to their coming out. This was from 1890, the Tribune. Headline, "With Skulls for Bowls. A Night in the Suddenly Famous Whitechapel Club. How convivial spirits drink their punch in honor of their patron saint, Jack the Ripper." Within the last few days, the Whitechapel Club of Chicago has drawn itself the eye of the nation. One turns out of Clark Street into a misty, muddy alley. Barrels and rubbish clutter the way. Then there comes LaSalle Street. One blunders over the car tracks and dodges flickering cabs and finds oneself once more in the dark and dingy alley. A few steps more. This is Calhoun Place. On one side is the basement den, where the messengers do congregate. On the other shine the lights that burn over the Whitechapel Club. One might almost imagine one were in the dark depths of Berners Court in London, where in months gone by Jack the Ripper carries on his investigations in the psychological vein. But outside it is all imagination, inside it is all reality. For inside one finds all the weird horrors that took their birth in the odorous slums of Whitechapel. Skulls of murderers lie on the table, and out of them Whitechapelians drink buoyant punches, as Byron did of old. And so one enters the swinging, glazed doors of the Whitechapel Club. So how did all of this end? Well, as I alluded to, the club became a victim of its own success. More and more people wanted in, they actually had to upgrade their location, and then for all their literary and philosophical aspirations, it was something as prosaic as a financial scandal that did them in. But what are we to make of this so many years later? I think it's very interesting from a true crime fandom preview standpoint. A true crime has gotten bigger and bigger, and people were always interested in reading or hearing about sensational crimes. But we do seem to be in a moment where it's bigger than it's ever been, so this is kind of an interesting, again, preview, and so long ago, and despite that, they went so much further than today's, fans and addicts do. I read everything I could find in getting ready to make this video, and one thing that seems entirely missing, at least from what I saw and heard, is some acknowledgement that there's just this kind of base and really awful heartlessness at the core of this thing. Jack the Ripper's victims, these poor, marginalized women, were butchered in the most unimaginable ways, and again, this was news of the day. Imagine trying to replicate this today if someone started a, Ted Bundy fan club right after all his crimes became known. Remember, Jack was supposed to be their actual president, called their patron saint. That would not fly at all today, and while some people might call that political correctness, and let's not get political here, I would definitely disagree. It's just a matter of actual decency. And we get it. It was just a lark. They didn't probably take this very seriously, right? They were not actual fans of a murderer. But I'd be infinitely more positive in my spin on this if we were talking about some old world club that was unafraid to laugh at death. Look it dead in the eye, pun intended. My most recent book was about death. The most recent author's presentation I gave was on the same subject, and, I put a lot of humor in there. So I'm all for that, 100%, but it's a different thing when you're harvesting these actual grisly, incredibly recent murders. It's just my opinion, but this comes off as more of a callous frat boy thing than any kind of literary or philosophical movement or club. But that is the story of Chicago's Whitechapel Club, a short-lived phenomenon that left its mark, and has interesting tie-ins to one of today's pop culture obsessions. Thanks for watching the video.